Hello, today I'd like to talk about publishing journal articles in the social sciences. So this talk is aimed at researchers that are starting off in the social sciences or would just like a refresher about publishing journal articles for the social sciences. So I'm going to talk about a range of different aspects of publishing, not just selecting a journal to publish in, but the main different aspects of the publishing process based around writing up the research for a journal. So I'm going to talk about the following different things: picking a good research topic, finding your audience and purpose for your study, being careful with the research design and methods, literature searching, a critical analysis of the literature, selecting theory for your study, selecting journals and writing for the selected journal, the structure of the article, coping with and learning from referee criticisms, coping with and learning from rejection, and alternatives for journals for publishing. So lots of different topics around the theme of writing and publishing journal articles. Okay, so first of all, picking a good research topic. So what makes a good research topic? This is something you have to think about at the start of your project, although it might get modified as you go along. So interesting to you, because you don't want to be spending a lot of time looking at something that you're not interested in, and you probably won't want to work as hard if it's something that you're not really interested in. So it does need to be interesting to you, but it also needs to be interesting to some other people, the people that you expect to read the paper or that you hope to read the paper. So you have to think not just about yourselves, but about other people. And it's a good idea to think concretely about either the individual people or the type of person that would find your topic interesting. So it doesn't matter how interesting your topic is to you if it's not interesting to anyone else, because it won't get published anywhere. A good research topic also, with a few exceptions, relates to previous research in some way. The more directly, the better. So when people come to me with a research topic that I don't think relates to previous research, I'll ask them to do literature searches and find out how it does relate to previous research and come up with evidence that it relates to previous research in some way. And I'll talk about this more later in the literature review part. But the core job for a social scientist writing a paper is usually, especially if it's a paper based on some kind of data that you've collected yourself, usually you need to fill a gap in academic knowledge. So you have to relate to previous research and show that you're not replicating what's been done before. So this is rare in the social sciences, replication studies, but you're filling a gap. You're doing something that has never been done before, but is similar to, in some way, previous research. Or if not similar, relates to previous research in such a way that it clearly fills a gap. So I always think of a new study in terms of what gap does this address. And as a referee and as an editor, when I look at a study, that's one of the first questions I think about. Does this study fill a gap or does it not? Does it just repeat what's already been done? Or is it not really relevant in the sense, okay, no one's done it before, but we don't really care about it. So it's not really filling a gap. It's off in the middle of nowhere. Another important thing is, unless you have a good reason to pick an old topic, a good research topic shouldn't be too old. So a very old research topic, or even a moderately old research topic, will be less interesting to other researchers, because they'll want to be moving on to newer research topics and reading about newer research topics. So the age of a topic does affect how likely it is to get an audience and how likely it is to get published as well. and your research topic, if you want it to get published in a journal, and maybe you want to write a book instead, in which case you've come to the wrong talk. If you want to get published in a journal, then your topic needs to have journals relevant to that topic. That's not a hard and fast rule, because there are some generalist journals that will publish on any topic. For example, PLOS One publishes on any topic. It doesn't have any restrictions as far as I'm aware. And there are a range of other journals that don't have restrictions, but in general you have more choice and more chance of attracting an audience and more chance of being able to justify your research is relevant if there are journals related to the topic. And another thing, your good research topic should fit with your expected publishing time span. So what I mean is that you need to consider how long you think it will take. How long realistically do you think it will take before starting a research and getting something that you submit to a journal for consideration for publishing? And if that's a long time span, then you shouldn't choose a topic that will go stale, that will be not relevant because of the time gap. So for example, if your topic is on an issue that changes very rapidly, then a 4-year project to study that wouldn't be very helpful, because once you try to publish your results, they're likely to be out of date. So for example, at the moment, if you studied the population reaction to vaccine, whether they were hesitant about getting a vaccine or not, if you wanted to start your study now and publish in 4 years' time, then probably people's attitudes to vaccines in 4 years' time will be completely different to today, because hopefully most people in the world will have had the COVID vaccine by then. So we'll be in a completely different situation, whereas at the moment most people in the world haven't had the vaccine. And so hopefully in 4 years' time, we'll know the vaccines are safe and they're effective. So attitudes will be completely different. So that would be a really bad research topic if you expect to spend 4 years studying it. But if you thought you could do everything within 6 months, then that's great. That's a really good research topic, because you'll be able to do the timely publishing necessary for it. So some ideas of how research topics for individual fields change over time. So this is a little bit of a strange graph, but this is 4 different fields in Scopus, and for each year the word there is the hottest word in that year, in the sense that that's the word that's most frequently in that year compared to previous years in that study, in that field. So we've got 4 fields: library and information science on the left, then epidemiology, then social psychology, and then visual and performing arts. So lots and lots of words, but let me just pull out a couple of points. So first of all, in epidemiology, you can see clear trends. In 2003, 2004, there were lots of papers about SARS. Unsurprisingly, that's when the outbreak happened. And in 2009 to 2011, there were lots of papers about H1N1, again coinciding with an outbreak. And then 2015, Ebola, 2016, Zika, so corresponding to the outbreaks of these viruses as well. So some of the information in this timeline ties to what's happening in the non-academic world, in the rest of the world, the kinds of viruses that are releasing in the community. I would bet my house that the key word for 2020 would be COVID-19. That'll be this year's big topic for epidemiologists. So if you're an epidemiologist, I wouldn't recommend that you choose to study SARS rather than COVID-19, because SARS is no longer a hot topic in epidemiology. So I think that's clear for epidemiology, but this also happens in the social sciences. And I'm going to give the example of library and information science. So this is an area I research in myself. So in 2006, Google was a hot topic in library and information science, and it hasn't been since then. So if you wanted to do a library and information science study and it was based on Google, then you would find not so many people interested in it in 2021 than were in 2006. So 2006, the journals would have probably snapped up your article and published it, and you'd have lots of interested readers. But it's no longer a hot topic. So it's no longer okay, you can still study Google. Google is still relevant. We've all heard of Google. But it's not as hot a topic as it was in 2006. So you'd need a good reason to study Google, given that it's sort of out of fashion in terms of library and information science research anyway. And other examples, altmetric research became popular in 2014. It's still going on today, but it's no longer in its hot topic phase, and research on datasets became more popular in 2015 in library and information science anyway. So after that it became less popular. It's still going on. So if you're picking a new study, then I wouldn't pick any topic that's been going for a long time unless you've got a clear reason to select that topic. So in social psychology, I think we also have trends in terms of issues that people study particularly intensively for short periods of time. For example, cyberbullying 2012. So that's no longer such a big issue in 2020. Still goes on, but it's no longer such a big issue for social psychology as it was in 2012. And if you're more on the side of the arts and humanities, then they don't really have hot topics. So if you look at the list of top terms for visual and performing arts, they look pretty random to me. So no real trends. Okay, so make sure your topic's not old. You also need to find your audience and your purpose for your study. So you need to think about who will find your paper interesting and useful. What kinds of people will find your paper interesting and useful. Useful in the sense that it helps them do their job, whether it's research or some other job. And particularly for journal publishing, you need to think about which academic field your results could help. So what kinds of papers might need to cite your research as evidence, or what kinds of papers is your study relevant to, so they might want to mention your research. And so in academic fields, give you one sort of audience. Another sort of audience is the practitioner. So this isn't relevant to all social sciences, but I think most social sciences have relevance to practitioners. So in terms of the purpose of your study, you can ask which practitioners might act differently based on the findings and the studies of your study. So, okay, you don't know what the findings are, but you might think, okay, if I get interesting findings, how will that affect what practitioners do? So you need to think about, okay, which practitioners are relevant to my topic, and then what activities might they change based on the findings. So maybe the practitioners are nurses, for example. So then the question is, what a nurse does might change because of what you find with your research. Or maybe your practitioners are librarians, so how do you help them do their job, or how do you help them do it differently? Or maybe social workers, how will you inform what they do on a day-to-day basis, or any aspect of their job? Or how might your results help society in other ways? So you might not directly influence practitioners, but you might provide wider help to society in some ways, for example, through politics or well-being in some way. So if you can think about how that's possible for your topic, and if you can get a good answer for your topic, then that's a good, that helps you to decide that this is a good topic to study. So consider adjusting your purpose to get good answers to these questions. So if you look at these and you think, well, no one's going to care about this, it'll only be me that reads it. So it's not a good topic. It's definitely not a good topic. So you might hope that someone reads it maybe 50 years in the future and finds something useful for it, but it's more likely to be regarded as a good paper and get used if you can think of how that's possible, rather than just hoping that it might happen. Okay, so I'd like to have a look at one example of an article. So this is an abstract of an article, and I'd like to draw attention to some aspects of this article. So in the abstract, I think this sentence establishes a research gap. So I mentioned that for a good research topic, it should address a research gap. So here it says, despite this, no prior study has attempted to, and then whatever the study is. So this is stating explicitly, it doesn't use the word gap, but almost explicit, but almost using the word gap. It could have used the word gap. No prior study has attempted to, and then what does it do? Assess variations in the structure of academic papers across all disciplines. So it's saying this hasn't been done before, therefore there's a gap for this study to do it. And then these sentences suggest the practical value of the results to an audience. So researchers should be aware of unfamiliar structures that are nevertheless legitimate when reading, writing and reviewing articles. So this has practical value to people. Researchers, these are the group that it's practical for, and the activities of reading, writing and reviewing articles. Okay, so the abstract makes a claim for a research gap and also makes a claim as a practical value for the audience. So some journals ask you to state how your findings will have a practical value in this way. This particular journal doesn't, but many journals have structured abstracts in which there's a heading for practical value, and you've got to explain how your study has that, or you're much less likely to get published. And also I think reviewers will like your article if there's clear value for it, much more than if they can't see the value. Okay, next stage, so taking care with research design and methods. So a common problem with studies submitted to journals that don't get published is that the research design isn't very good or the methods aren't very careful. So good research design and methods are at the heart of academic research, and that's because if you've got weak methods, then your research may be completely useless. So if you can't justify the findings with strong enough methods, then there's no point in doing the study. It's also important to make sure that the methods that you choose match your purpose or your research questions. So another problem is that many studies, well, some studies, have a method that doesn't really address the research questions. So there's a mismatch between the methods and the research questions. It's very easy to do, to be honest, to come up with your purpose and then come up with good methods and then not realize that the methods don't actually fit the purpose. And it's also important to learn the methods very carefully and practice them. So a common failing is to just look for a method that might be okay and then just have a go with a method and report the results. So a reviewer will be looking to see that you're really a master of these methods and you've applied them very carefully so that they can trust the results that you've got with these methods. So you need to critically evaluate to the extent to which your methods address your purpose and are suitable. So you need to understand the methods well enough so that you can make a decision about whether they're suitable for your article and then also carry them out effectively. And some methods are fixed and you can't change them, but others have some flexibility in. And then if they have flexibility, then you should consider adjusting the methods to suit your purpose as necessary and justifying any changes that you make to the methods. And when you're applying the methods, make sure that you document and justify all the methods choices that you make. The overall research design and all the individual stages. So very, very common issue in refereeing is that the researcher has just explained what they've done but hasn't justified why they've done it that way. So the referee will ask, well, why have you done it this way instead of that way? Surely if you'd done it another way you might have got better results. So they won't be saying that if you explain why you did it the way you chose in the first place. And you should have a good reason. You should know what alternatives there could have been, and have a good reason, a good explanation as to why you didn't apply the alternatives. And sometimes the alternatives might be just as good, and you have to admit, well, I could have done it this other way, and there was no particular reason to do it the other way rather than this way, but my preference was for this way. But you should only use that kind of line of arguing if you're pretty sure that the two methods are essentially interchangeable. There's no good reason to choose one rather than the other. Okay, next stage, literature searching. So where are we going to search for relevant literature? So literature-like methods are at the heart of academic research. So in some ways the difference between academic research and non-academic research is that with academic research the findings are tied to academic literature. So you follow the standards of academic research as described in the literature, and you also relate your findings to other academic research published in the literature. So it's really the heart of a good paper and a good research study, deep embedding in the literature for methods and for purpose as well. So it's important to read a lot of relevant papers. So this does take a long time. It's very time consuming to read a lot of papers. So finding the relevant papers is a key first step. So the literature search part is key. So where would you find relevant papers? So I'm guessing you probably use Google Scholar as your first port of call. You might also use dimensions.ai, and you might also use the Web of Science, Scopus. Maybe you have discipline specific indexes, or you might even know of relevant journals that aren't indexed in any of these sites, but you still want to search them. So these are the kind of things that you need to consider when you're looking for the literature. So pick one or more relevant sources, and particularly if you're not getting many results, try a range of different sources. So Google Scholar and Dimensions are good for wide coverage of academic research. They'll cover more papers than the Web of Science and Scopus, but the Web of Science and Scopus should cover core academic papers. But it depends which academic field you work in, which will work best. So you need to try them all out, I guess, to find out which works best for your topic. For example, dimensions. Here's a query in dimensions. So I've searched for bullying, research related to bullying, and I've selected the years 2021, 2020 and 2019 to get recent research about bullying. And it's found 54,235 publications from the last 3 years about bullying. And I'm just highlighting here on the right that Dimensions gives you sorting options, so you can pick the order in which the results appear on the screen. And here we've got 54,000, so that's too many to read them all. So you might want to search them by relevance. That's the default. View them by relevance, so the most relevant first, or you might want the ones with the most citations at the top, or the most online attention, which is the altmetric attention score. So you could try different ones to see which gets you the most relevant results at the top of the list. But to be honest, for this search, I think I would try a narrower search, because 54,000 is just too big. So there must be lots of not relevant searches. So I would try an advanced search to narrow down the results. Maybe bullying has to be in the the title or the abstract and not the rest of the paper. So that would narrow down the results a lot to make it more relevant to my query. So next stage of literature searching. So what do we look for papers about for the literature search? Well, mainly the research topic. So this is the obvious thing. Your literature search should find papers most related to your research topic, and you should try to be as comprehensive as possible and really completely comprehensive for recent research. So you can get away with being less comprehensive for older papers, I think, but you do need to make sure that you've captured all the recent research on your topic. So the goal isn't to find some relevant research, but it's to find the most relevant research and to find all of the most relevant research. And this is critical because, as I've mentioned before, you need to establish a gap for your research. And if you can't convince the referees that, for the journal referees, that you've read all the relevant research, then they won't believe you when they say that your research fills a gap. So again, a common a source of rejection in submissions to journals is the referees not being convinced that you know the literature of the field, and therefore not convinced that your research question or your research problem is a new one or fills a gap. So literature searching for your research topic, also the background to your research topic. So this depends how your field works, whether they expect background to go in the literature review as well. So this would be things that aren't directly about your research topic but give a little bit of context to it. And if you don't have much relevant research, then you might want to include issues similar to your research topic, but I would only do that if there's not much relevant to your research. And research methods, so you need to make sure that you've searched for relevant publications for your methods, especially if it's not a straightforward statistical method, but if it's a method that has some flexibility, then you want to see how it's applied in recent papers. And the theory. So if many social sciences studies have a theory that's at the core of them, so my papers don't usually, but in many fields theory is at the core of the papers, so obviously you need to include the theory in your study, in your literature search, so that you can be informed by the latest ideas on the theory. So how do we do the literature searching? So try a different range of keywords and phrase searches. So my experience is that this is often done in a bit of a slapdash way rather than systematically. So a slapdash way might be just having a guess at some keywords and trying them and then just writing down what you find or reading what you find. But you need to try a range to find the best searches and all the relevant searches. So it's a good idea to learn the advanced search functions and practice the advanced search functions, things like filtering by year to get the most recent ones, and sometimes it's useful to filter by journal or subject. So it depends on what your topic is, whether you need to filter by journal or subject to get relevant results. But if you're getting too many irrelevant results to your query, initial query, then you need to think about either changing the query or using filters to narrow down the results. And also be on the lookout for academic jargon terms to describe your topic. So for example, search engine research isn't called search engine research, it's called information retrieval. So the best query for search engine research would be information retrieval rather than search engine research. So you would discover that if you found some relevant papers and you kept your wits about you, and you would notice, okay, they keep using this phrase information retrieval, I wonder what that means. And then maybe you look it up on Wikipedia and you realize that that's the academic-y term for search engine research. So there are information retrieval conferences, information retrieval journals. So highlighting the importance of the term. And then once you've done that, you can read the abstracts of potentially relevant titles. So you read the titles first to check whether you think the title is relevant. Then you read the abstract to make a second decision to see if you think the paper is probably relevant. And then you can download to read the full text. And spend some time widening the search, lateral thinking to get additional results, especially if you don't get many relevant papers. So I've in the past I've sometimes been caught out, one time very embarrassingly, where despite all my literature searches I missed almost all of the relevant papers for one study that I did. So they were quite hard to find. They were published in a edited book rather than any journals, and they used terminology that I hadn't come across. But I might have found it if I'd have tried harder and used more lateral thinking. So the worst outcome would be to completely miss the relevant research and find out that what you have just finished has already been done before, or is known to be redundant, or the research is done with different methods that are known to be better in some way. So full text is often online now, and some people cheat and get the ones that aren't online via the Sci-Hub website. So for example, this is a Google Scholar search for information retrieval. The information retrieval, so I've put quotes around information retrieval to make sure it's the exact phrase information retrieval. So I think the quotes are underused in literature searches, but helpful to narrow down the results. And they see lots of results about information retrieval, and these are all about search engines. So modern information retrieval at the top. This is a book about search engines, a big important book about search engines. So this is showing that the best term is sometimes not the one that you might start with. More on literature searching. So some extra tips on literature searching. So one tip is citation chaining, looking for papers that cite the most relevant papers. So if you find a paper and it's really important to your study, then look at the papers that cite that one, because they might be related. A lot of them won't be related probably, but some of them may be related, and some of them might be updates. So they improve on what's in the key paper. And you really don't want to miss out anything that updates and improves your key paper. So citation check. So most of the search databases will give you a link that you can click on, and it takes you to a list of the citing papers. So that's how you can do the citation chaining. And also author chaining. If you find that there are important papers written by authors, or one author's written a few different papers, then it's a good idea to check all the papers written by the author in case they've written other relevant articles that you haven't found. So more papers that cite your key papers, or more papers by the same author. And another tip is make sure you get the current research. So you can use a year filters to make sure that some of your results are current. So it's again, it's a cardinal sin to have a reference list which is mainly old papers and you don't have new ones. And key papers are usually highly cited articles that are relevant to your study, say something important to your study. So it's useful to check the citation count to find articles that might be making key contributions to the study. So this is an example, back to the information retrieval. This is an example. This is author chaining. So I found in my information retrieval search that Ricardo Baeza-Yates has written at least 2 relevant publications. And now I can look down his Google Scholar profile to see all his different publications. And some of them are about search engines, but don't include information retrieval or search engines, these phrases. So this is another way of finding relevant papers. Okay, so I found a relevant paper that doesn't mention the search terms through author chaining in Google Scholar. So if an author's on Google Scholar, you can click on their name in the results and it takes you to their profile page with a list of their publications. Okay, next stage is critically analysing the literature. So you found lots of literature and you need to read it, and then the next stage, critical analysis. So again, a common failing of articles submitted to journals is that the literature review isn't very critical. It just reports what the previous studies have found as facts without discussing the limitations of the studies or the gaps left by the studies. So read papers with a critical eye for limitations and gaps. So many academic papers will have straightforward mistakes. So most don't, I think, but many will have a mistake. So the wrong methods, assumptions that just aren't true, deductions that are illogical, that have somehow got through peer review. And this is more likely, I think, in journals with no peer review or weak journals that don't have very effective peer review. But all papers have some limitations, so I don't think there's been a paper that is perfect, at least a social science paper. Almost by definition, it's impossible to write a perfect social science paper. So the types of limitations that are endemic to the social sciences are limited sample. For example, many papers just apply to the USA and might not tell you anything about India, for example, or just try students and won't tell you about people in other professions. The statistical test assumptions are almost always not fully valid, so there are some limitations in terms of the statistical tests used, if any, and some of the interpretations might be based on human judgments, and then that has its own limitations. So different humans might have produced different interpretations. And with some methods, there are some standard limitations that have to be discussed, such as the researcher perspective needs to be discussed in most qualitative research. So in your literature review, you need to critically analyse the papers, point to weaknesses. So if the methods are wrong, you probably don't want the paper in your literature review unless it's really central to your study, in which case you'd have to criticise the methods. But if it's basically valid but has some limitations, then you can include some critical points. And another thing you can look for is the difference between what the paper claims and what it actually shows. And this is often not the same because the conclusions extrapolate from the findings. And sometimes in the abstract, you get a little bit of results creep where the abstract says it's found something more general than it actually has found. So the abstract might claim that, I don't know, every child that's been bullied has mental health problems in later life, but in fact the study only analysed one school in the USA, so the conclusion is a bit overgeneral for the data they've analysed. And the critical analysis can help you avoid mistakes of previous papers and also learn from their discoveries and their methods to make sure that your methods are as strong as possible. Okay, so on to writing the literature review, just a few tips on this. So important points should be addressed by multiple sources. So as a referee, I like to see multiple references for key points. Synthesize and structure the literature review around themes, so avoid lists if at all possible. Synthesize means use different studies to address related points and generalize as far as you can. And structure around themes means if you have, say, 20 papers that are relevant to your study, organize them into groups in some way so that you're discussing papers that are related in the same part of the literature review. So use headings to organize a literature review. It's always much easier to read a paper, I think, if the literature review is split into subheadings so that you can see which topics are covered in it, and relate the papers to each other rather than discussing them separately. So bad literature review often just discusses each paper separately rather than making a general point by synthesizing them together. And it's difficult. I still find it difficult to write a good literature review. I think I'm not a particularly good literature review writer, so I recommend reading books with advice about this. Pick up tips about how to improve your literature review writing. So here's an example of a section from a literature review, which I think is a good one, and it illustrates the synthesis theme and also using multiple references. So this uses the numbering system for references, and I think that this section of a literature review makes 3 related points and organizes them together well into a single paragraph. So the red line split up the first, the second and the third point, and you can see that for the first and third point there are 3 references to back up each one. The second point, there's only 1 reference and it goes into a bit more detail, but the whole paragraph is discussing related issues. So the paragraph makes sense and also covers a lot of relevant issues from the literature. So I think this is a good example of synthesis in a literature review. So I hope you can read that, and even if you don't care about the issue, you can see that the different bits of the paragraph fit together really well. The first bit relates to the second bit, relates to the third bit. So it's a good synthesis of the studies. Okay, selecting theory. So this is something that I think I'm also not good at, because I tend to publish in social science areas that don't have heavy theory use. So many, not all, social science papers use academic theory as part of the interpretation strategy, and I think this is particularly true in qualitative research, or research that doesn't have data but just is analytical. And the theories used differ a lot between fields. So after you've chosen your topic, you need to think very carefully about theories that fit your topic. They vary in popularity over time, theories. So there are big theories that seem to stay popular for decades, and other ones might come and go. So you need to make sure that you are using a theory that is still regarded as valid and useful now. So if you found a relevant theory from 20 years ago and it was no longer cited much or no longer mentioned much in current research, then it wouldn't be a good idea to use it, I think, unless you have a very strong reason. So the theory's got to be relevant to your topic and methods, and probably already used in your field. So if not, you need a good reason why to pick that particular theory. And the theory ought to be critically analysed, including updates of it in the literature review or background section of your paper. Okay, so on to journals. How do we select journals? So the journal needs to be relevant to your topic, and so it should have published related papers before. So if you read the journal, if you scan through the journal article titles and you can't find anything related to your topic published in that journal, it's probably not a good idea to submit to that journal for publication. And a good journal will probably, or a relevant journal will probably have some of the references that you cited, especially core and recent references. So when I'm thinking about where to submit a paper, I often look down my reference list and find which journals am I citing the most often, and then those will be the first ones I consider as for submitting a paper to. So if they already publish on that topic, then they're more likely to publish your paper than another journal that doesn't publish on that topic. And you could also consult journal lists, such as in the Web of Science, the Journal Citation Reports, or in Dimensions whenever you run a search, it gives you a list of journals that match your query, or the Web of Science and Scopus do as well, and they might suggest ideas of where you can publish. And very, very, very important, avoid the predatory journals. So these are the journals that typically pay to publish. They're open access, but you have to pay to get your article published. There is no single guideline for what is and what isn't a predatory journal, but I would avoid anything which has all these characteristics. So unknown editorial boards means it's probably not a good journal. So people in your field don't know any of the editors, or don't respect any of the editors, then it wouldn't be a good journal to submit to. And also very general journal titles are sometimes a giveaway of a predatory journal, and maybe you can tell that the publisher is a fake publisher or not a genuine academic publishing house, although that's very difficult to tell. But if you end up paying to publish in a predatory journal, then that probably damages your career more than not publishing, because it shows that you're not aware of the difference between a predatory and a normal journal. So here's an example of journals relevant to a search in Dimensions. So I've run a search for bullying in 2019 to 21, and if you look at the sidebar, one sidebar lists top researchers, or researchers that have published the most articles in this list. So these would be suitable for author chaining. Just check they haven't written other articles about bullying that are relevant and that you've missed. And you can look at the source titles list for possible journals to submit to. So this one, although the topic is bullying, there are no bullying journals in the list. So it seems that most bullying research is published in other journals. So Frontiers in Psychology, so maybe it's psychology, that's a really big journal. So maybe it's Psychology Research that publishes it, and Children and Youth Services Review. So bullying is obviously a relevant topic for that as well. So that might give you ideas about where to publish. Prestige, a lot of people ask me, which is the best journal, which is the most prestigious journal to submit to? Is it the one with the highest journal impact factor? And I think that the key point here is to pick a journal to help you to get the biggest audience. So relevance to your topic is more important than prestige of the journal. So if you go for a prestigious journal, then that can help your career and also help you to attract a larger audience, but only if it's also relevant to your topic. So if it's not relevant to your topic, they probably won't publish your paper anyway, and it wouldn't help you to get a larger audience if the wrong audience is reading the paper. So how do you judge the prestige of a journal? So you shouldn't use the journal impact factor as your main guide, but the main guide should be reputation amongst the scholars in your field. So when you meet people and talk to them, you might ask about which journals they rate, which journals they think are good. And when you read papers in your literature review, look at the journals that are publishing the papers that you think are really good ones. So a combination of the two can get you an idea about which are the prestigious journals for your topic. And it's also true to say that prestigious journals for one topic are not prestigious for another. So it is really a topic specific thing. So some people use the journal impact factors, and I think they're okay as a rule of thumb, a general rule of thumb, but it's your field expertise. Field relevance is more important, and reputation in the field. Journal editorial quality. So another factor to consider when picking a journal is that a good journal tends to have strict reviewing. So for this, the editors will typically contact at least 2 experts in the field to check the accuracy, relevance and clarity of your paper, amongst other things. And the speed of the reviewing varies a lot between journals. So some typically get a response back in weeks. So some of the really good medical journals are super quick. but others might take years to get your reviewing back to you. So I always check the speed of a journal, of the reviewing in a journal, or either using my own prior knowledge or what the journal reports on its website, or by looking at the submitted, published, accepted dates on recent articles. And because my research tends to be relating to topical issues, often I try to publish in journals with quick editorial review. Speed's also important for jobs. So you want to get your publications in time for applying for a postdoctoral job, for example, but also for new topics. So if you're investigating something that's relatively new or relatively fast moving, then you have to go for a fast editorial review journal. But it has to be good quality reviewing. So it can't be a fake super quick review in one of these predatory journals. So writing for the selected journal, once you've picked your journal, so do read the author guidelines, which will tell you things like the format of the references, the maximum length of the paper, how many words are you allowed in the paper, maybe limitations on the number of figures or tables, any other style requirements, so they might specify headings that you have to use or some other requirements. So read the guidelines and make sure you follow them really strictly. You don't want to give the reviewers an extra reason to reject your paper because it doesn't follow the style guidelines. And also read papers published in the journal for writing style. There are aspects of style that you can't pick up from the official author guidelines, but the people writing the articles in the journal might give you ideas for. Such as the paper structure. Sometimes the author guidelines will specify a structure for the paper, sometimes not, but you can see what kind of structures are published in the journal by reading papers. And also what kind of things are put in the abstract. That's sometimes hard to write, but you can check that by reading abstracts in recent published papers in the journal. So keep to the author guidelines really strictly and follow the normal writing style for the journal unless you've got a good reason not to. And consider the structure of your paper. So there's not one perfect structure for all academic research, particularly in the social sciences. In some fields there's a recommended structure or a very common structure, but not in the social sciences, but there might be in some fields. So you do need to check in your field what the accepted structures are, and also what the typical contents are of each section. So particularly the introduction, the contents of the introduction vary a lot between fields, so you need to know what kind of things people put in the introduction. So I'll talk about that a bit more later on. But typical errors in papers include missing details, particularly in the methods, or the introduction not justifying the research question. So that's the reviewer. You can expect reviewers to pick you up if your introduction doesn't justify your research question or the purpose of your study. So reviewers that find many basic deviations from the accepted style might reject your article without reading it carefully, or you might get a desk reject from the editor of the journal. So more on article structure. So this is my default structure. So this is the structure I always use to start with, and sometimes I vary it, but this is what I think of when I write a paper, and then I'll only vary it if there's a good reason to. So I always have introduction, and I think of a 3-paragraph introduction. Paragraph 1 explains the importance of the problem, so it's kind of wider context and problem importance. Paragraph 2 summarizes what's already known about the problem, and then paragraph 3 describes the research gap, and usually for me states the research questions. So in the social sciences, I don't know if you've heard of the CARS model, create a research space. So the idea is that in the social sciences, particularly in the introduction, you need to establish the space in which you're conducting your research, the intellectual space in which you're conducting your research. So the background or the literature review. So I usually have a separate background or literature review, but sometimes I put a short background or literature review into the introduction instead of paragraph 2. So it depends on how long the journal allows articles to be. So if the journal has quite a short length guideline, like 6,000 words, then I would have to put the background, really squash it down into 1 or 2 paragraphs in the middle of the introduction rather than a separate section. But otherwise, I would have a separate background section called background or literature review or related work, always the second in the paper for me if it's included. And so in almost all fields, the background and literature review would be the second thing, but in some areas of computing they put it near the end. But in the social sciences, I think we all put it second after the introduction. And it splits into subsections for different topics. So to help you organise, if you have to give subsections with headings, it helps you organise and helps the reader to understand what you're covering. And that's particularly useful because your literature review, by definition, covers lots of different things, and it's condensing information about lots of other studies, so it is hard to read from that perspective. So the headings and the structure really help. And then the methods, so the kinds of things that should go in the methods: the overall research design, description of the methods, and a very common failing is having just the description of the methods and no research design, which would set the context of the methods that are used, and no justification of the method. So that's really common and a big failing. So your method should be justified in enough detail that the reviewers can check that you've not made a mistake. Next section that I always use is results. In qualitative research, they often use the heading findings instead of results. And then discussion. I always start with a frank admission, what I think of as a frank admission of the limitations of the study, and then relate the results to the literature review. So what did I find that confirms or disproves or fits into a gap left by the literature review, and sometimes report follow-up analyses to expand on some of the results. And then the conclusions summarise the main results, and then implications for practice or other researchers. So conclusions, I try to target the wider value of the work, establish the value of the work through the results. So implications for practice or other researchers, that's the value of the research for other people. So the conclusions are kind of the outward-looking part of the paper and future-looking part of the paper in that sense. So I don't like to put future research suggestions in the conclusions, but other people do. And then references. So just out of interest, this graph shows the percentage of different headings that are used in different academic fields. The yellow is the social sciences, and you can see that in the social sciences there's no one heading that's used in the majority of all papers. So there really are there is a wide variation in the headings used in academic research. So only 30% of social science papers seem to use the introduction heading, which I find incredible. I always use it. But discussion is very common in the social sciences, or results and discussion separately, or results separately is very common as well. So there isn't one standard format. So I've shown you the format that I always follow, but there isn't one standard format that everyone follows. So if you look at articles in the journal that you're going to publish in, you might pick up if there is or there isn't a standard format for that journal. Okay, so let's say we've submitted our article and we haven't had a desk reject from the editor, and it's been sent to review, and then we get back some criticisms from the reviewers. So if you're lucky, you might just get a few criticisms that lead to corrections, and if you're unlucky you might get a lot of criticisms. So I think the most criticisms I've had was 45 pages of criticisms. 45. It was 3 times longer than the paper itself. So I had detailed criticisms from 4 different reviewers. So actually it was the criticisms plus my responses that took up 45 pages. But it was heartbreaking to get that many criticisms on the paper. It did eventually get published, and the criticisms did improve the paper. But yeah, it was terrible to see them for the first time. So reviewers usually produce a list of necessary major and minor changes. So major changes might require a lot of work, and minor changes might be just typos or just small things that you need to change. So when you get the criticisms, it's crucial to make all the changes as well as you can, and also make a document explaining how your article has been changed. So you need to make the changes and explain how you've made the changes. So don't argue with the reviewer, and don't tell the reviewer the answers to the reviewer's question. Tell the reviewer instead how you've changed the paper to answer their question. So one thing I hate as a reviewer is the author telling me what the answer is, but then not changing the paper. So if I tell as a reviewer, if I tell the author, look, this isn't right about the paper, or I say, why haven't you done this? And the reviewer, the author writes back to me and says, well, I didn't do that because of this reason. So I don't want you to do that. I want you to change the paper, put your reason in, and then tell me that you've changed the paper to put your reason in, and tell me what the change was. And if you don't agree with the reviewer, you have to look at it from their perspective. And even if the reviewer says something that's not right, that stems from a misinterpretation of your work, you can change your paper to stop other people from making the same misinterpretation of the work. So whatever the reviewer says, almost always, you can change the paper to address that point. Either fix the mistake or make sure no one else comes up with the same misunderstanding. So your comment to the reviewer might be, I've clarified this point by making this change. So you should only argue with the reviewer if it's really unavoidable. So if the reviewers ask you to do something that you know is wrong, and you can say, well, I'm sorry, I haven't done this because this reason makes it the wrong thing to do. So I very rarely do that. I think maybe 1 paper in 20 argue with the reviewer, maybe even less than that. I don't know. So if a reviewer has misunderstood your work, change it so that no one can misunderstand in the same way. So reviewers are part of your audience. They're selected from the potential audience of your paper. So if they can make that misunderstanding, a lot of other people could as well. And just on a human level, it's very distressing. I find it really disappointing to get criticism on my papers, and every paper gets criticism. I've never had a paper back where the referee's comments are, this is brilliant, we must publish it with no changes. So you need a strategy for coping with being criticised. So it's not nice, is it, being criticised all the time? So my personal strategy is I'll quickly read the criticisms, and then I'll forget about them for at least a day. So I spend a day recovering from the shock of getting my work detailedly criticised, and then the following day I'll start to go through and edit the paper to address all the criticisms. So I need a day to recover from the shock. I don't know, psychologically for me. So that's my strategy, and you might need to develop your own. And if you'd like to see examples of what peer review criticism looks like, then you can see published review reports in various places. So F1000 Research publishes reviewer reports, and the BMJ publishes review reports. So you can see what articles get criticised for. I think journals are increasingly now publishing review reports, so it's easier to see examples of reviewer criticism. So these are some from the BMJ criticism. So the reviewer comment is, please consider specifying in the title that this study comes from the Nurses' Health Study 2. So the author's response here is, we changed the title to include Nurses' Health Study 2, as you can see. And the third reviewer comment here is, please revise the conclusion in the abstract to avoid overly causal language. And the author's response is, okay, we've changed the word can to the word might, so that it's not as causal as before. So that's a fairly minor change. I'm not sure if that's enough. But so you can see how the author is describing how they changed the paper. They're not arguing with the reviewer, and they're not telling the reviewer an answer. They're explaining to the reviewer, this is the change I've made in the paper. So that's what I like to see as a reviewer, just a list of changes and explanations. So some common reviewer criticisms about significance. Topic isn't important. That's a common criticism from reviewers. Your topic isn't important. Key previous studies are not considered, or the paper only cites studies that support the project. So this is really maybe the single most common criticism. The literature review is inadequate, especially for rejection. Or you haven't critically analysed the reviewed papers. The background or literature review is too vague and doesn't focus on what's core to the study. I'm a little bit guilty of that. The study doesn't address a knowledge gap. The work includes results that have already been reported, so a little bit of double publishing. Or the contribution to the study is new, but it's not valuable enough to be worth publishing. So it's just not significant or valuable enough to publish. So some common reviewer criticisms about purpose. So missing the purpose completely, that's fairly common criticism. And some papers will need research questions or hypotheses, so most don't include them, but in some fields they're essential. A very common problem in my field is that the research questions or hypotheses don't address a knowledge gap. So the research questions are things that we already know the answers to. Common methods criticisms. The methods are not consistent with the purpose. So there's one purpose, and there's a good purpose. There are good methods, but they don't match up. The methods don't actually address the purpose of the paper. Very common, the method doesn't contain enough details to interpret the findings properly. So you don't really know what they've done, so you're not sure how to interpret the findings. Already had that one. And the sampling method doesn't match the study purpose. So similar to the methods not matching the purpose, the sampling doesn't match the purpose. Or the sampling doesn't minimize the possible biases. There would have been other ways to minimize biases. So it's never possible to get rid of all biases, but a reviewer would look for the fact that you put some work into making sure the biases aren't bigger than they have to be. So example criticisms from reviewers. It's not easy to establish how choices were made as to which data were or were not included. So insufficient method details. And then the second one, the same thing, insufficient details of the data, or more detail needed on the value. So repeatedly asking for more information in the methods. Common reviewer criticisms about the results. The results don't address the research questions or hypotheses or purpose. So that, again, a mismatch. Tables and figures not understandable without reading the text. So I think it's a good idea to try to make the tables and figures self-contained so that you can understand what the numbers mean or the information in the tables mean without having to read the whole paper. That really helps someone reading the paper to try and understand it. And if you're doing a qualitative study, then it's important to include selected quotes to illustrate your themes. So missing that out is a common criticism from reviewers, and just bad organisation for the results. And common criticisms of the discussion and conclusions. Not mentioning limitations, so the reviewers love to pull you up if you don't mention obvious limitations of your study, and every study has limitations in the social sciences. Another criticism is the results or the findings are just restated without any analysis, or the findings are not placed in the context of prior research. So you say what you found, but you don't say how it contributes to what was already known. Alternative explanations for the results are not discussed. So you might make a cause and effect claim and not discuss alternative potential. So this is relating to limitations, really. And the practical implications are not mentioned. This is sometimes called the so what question. Why should we care about what you've done? So if you can mention some practical implications of your findings, then that addresses this. So if things go badly and your paper gets rejected from a journal, what do you do? So first of all, just accept that that's normal for all researchers. We all get papers rejected. Well, maybe not everyone's had a paper rejected, but it is a common thing for nearly all researchers to have their papers rejected. I've had lots of papers rejected. For example, decide if the article can be salvaged and then submitted to another journal. Okay, so you get the reviewer's criticisms or the editor's criticisms, explanation at least, and it's important to use those criticisms to improve the paper before you're submitting it elsewhere, because you might get the same reviewers, and anyway you want to make your paper better, and the criticisms can help you make it better. So every rejection can be a learning experience, so if your methods are, if the criticisms are fatal and you realise that the paper is a waste of time, then don't submit it anywhere else. Just learn from the experience and do another study. Otherwise, you can look for another journal to submit it to. And if you can't get it published in a journal, and it doesn't have methods problems, then you can consider self-publishing it in various forms. So you could put it in a repository. So I don't know if your university has a repository, but that's one possible one. But my recommendation would be to put your paper in a relevant disciplinary repository, such as the Social Science Research Network, because that will help you to attract an audience for your study. So it's people are more likely to find your study if it's in a disciplinary repository relevant to your topic than if it's in your university repository. Unless your focus is local, in which case, fine, go ahead with the university repository. Ethics, I should mention ethics. Important to follow university ethics procedures for social science research. Absolutely essential. Don't do the research without getting ethical permission. And journals also have ethics requirements increasingly, and increasingly require you to explicitly state your ethical approval. And also author contributions are increasingly required by journals. So you have to be honest with journals. No plagiarism, no duplicate submissions. You have to be honest, or you get a bad reputation and you'll be banned, and your university might be informed of your actions. So here's an example of an ethics statement from a journal. So it's a section in the paper that explains the ethical approval. So this isn't usually required in the social sciences. It's more common in medical fields, but it is becoming increasingly common. So data and software sharing. So when writing an article, you might generate new data or software even, and if you share it, then it can help attract an audience for your work. So Figshare is the one I use. It's a free site where you can put your data and software, so it's best for data really. GitHub is another free site, and it's perfect for sharing software. So you can get a bigger audience if people reuse your data or your software, because that helps them to find out about your research. And it's also increasingly required by journals. So it's more and more common to see a journal say, you must have a data sharing statement in which you say where your data is or why you're not able to share it. So if it's personal information such as from interviews, then you might have to say, well, my ethical approval doesn't allow me to share the interview transcripts, and that's fine. But if it is shareable data, then it's good to share it. So this is a bit of my Figshare data sets. So these are all data sets I've had something to do with. So sometimes they're the data behind figures, and sometimes they're raw data from simulations, or extra pictures sometimes I put in as data sets. And sometimes more results than I can fit in the paper I'll put in a spreadsheet and upload to Figshare. And final stage, if you do get published, is monitoring the impact of your publications. So you can check the citations in Google or the altmetrics in Dimensions to show how much your work has been shared or registered, shared on social media. Altmetric.com tracks the social interest in the work, for example, through Dimensions. Useful evidence for your CVs, evidence of the reuse of your work. And also a good idea to publicize your work on social media. Make sure that people in your community know that you published a paper and can access it. So, for example, here is a paper in Dimensions that was recently published, and I've clicked on the altmetric button and it's telling me that it's been tweeted. One person tweeted it, and 16 people have had it to their reference manager, Mendeley. So although it's only got one citation, it's got at least 16 different people that have expressed some interest in it by adding it to Mendeley. So I think that's a good sign for this article. And you could mention that on your CV if you wanted to justify the impact of your research. So in summary, we've looked at picking a good topic, finding audience and purpose, being careful with the research design and methods, extensive literature search, critically analyse literature, select your theory carefully, select the journal by topic, audience, possibly prestige, write targeted for the selected journal. Don't write a general paper and then submit it to the journal. Write your paper targeted at that journal, structure your article appropriately, answer reviewer criticisms when you get them by changing the paper, cope with and learn from rejection, and then, if necessary, try alternatives to journals. So good luck with your research, and I hope that's helpful.